There's a saying in US politics stops at the water's edge, meaning that when it comes to issues inside of the United States, okay, we can debate, we can disagree. But when it comes to the rest of the world, then politics stops. Welcome to Overlap. I'm Walter Smolarek, joined by Albert Wang. Today we're going to be talking about infrastructure. So Albert, I wanted to start by asking you a question. What's public opinion like in China about the state of infrastructure? Are people satisfied with it? Are there, for instance, blackouts or flooding very frequently? What's the state of infrastructure and how do people feel about it?
That's a very big question. China is famous of building infrastructures effectively and efficiently, but I cannot just tell you that the Chinese people think our infrastructure is like, it is so good, we're so proud of it. That's not objective. Well, first of all, most of the Chinese people are like, certainly we're proud of our infrastructure and we're developing very fast comparing to like 40 years ago. China now has the longest railroad system in the world, a highway system, and we have 14 of the top 20 ports in the world in terms of cargo throughput. In 1990, there was no subway in Shanghai, but now the Shanghai Metro is more than 831 kilometers, number one in the world. With roads, like people can buy more cars, transport more goods, and people can travel to different cities to do business. Tourism boosts. When we talk about infrastructure, we are not just dealing with the roads. We are like talking everything happening on it. But it doesn't mean that we're satisfied. We still want to make it better. And China's terrain condition is very complex. We have to build infrastructure in different environments. So Chinese companies developed a very advanced high-tech skills on designing and constructing. So we can also actually help other countries build their infrastructure. After all, they all contribute to the economy. Well, for the question about how often do we have a blackout and city floods in China in recent years, the simple answer is that we still have it, but not very often. When I was a kid, we had those problems very often. Now it is less and less. The thing is that cities are combinations of many issues, and power supply is among the top of the list. The global natural environment is changing rapidly with hotter summers and colder winters. People need air conditioning. Factories and shops need electricity to run businesses. New energy vehicles need to power up. In order to ensure the power supply, China has also launched a mega infrastructure project called West to East Power Transmission. The western part of China is less populated, but has rich natural resources of solar, wind, and coal. We need to transmit the excesses, electricity from the west to the east through the power grid. However, I have to say, cities are developing way too fast. We have done a lot, but we still have power problems. Because the whole business of electricity is tricky. However, the climate is changing so fast in recent years. For example, Beijing's temperature had peaked to 104 Fahrenheit this summer. We are breaking the record almost every single day. It is almost impossible for the power system to counter the unpredictables. What's more, these achievements have been accomplished while making every effort to ensure people's basic need. On August 14, 2022, Sichuan province ran into a power shortage. So the provincial government gave an order to shut down all the industrial facilities and ensure the people's daily demand. From time to time, you need to make choice between economic development and the livelihood of the people. It is not simple because shutting down factories also means the rise of unemployment. So it is not one decision to be made. There are lots of math and statistics to be done. Therefore, China's infrastructure is good, but it doesn't mean we can keep all the natural crises away. On July 20th, the city of Zhengzhou experienced a historical heavy rain And the flooding caused more than 300 deaths and over 50 missing, and affected 14.5 million people around the Henan province. So the only thing I can say is that the Chinese government will always make a move. Okay, I think I have said too much. So what about the situation in the US? What do the US people see the infrastructure in the US?
Well, I think it's one of the most common thing that people in the United States complain about is just the sorry state of infrastructure in this country. You know, the fundamental situation, the economic context, I think is so different because, you know, China is, of course, a developing country. It's rising economically. And in the United States, infrastructure is really a question of things getting too old. You know, the infrastructure in the United States is aging. Most of it was built in the 1950s, 60s, some of it even earlier. So, you know, it's very common to hear people complain about, you know, for instance, potholes in the roads or the state of public transportation. I mean, I think that's one of the things that people, you know, are really upset about because it affects their day-to-day life in such a significant way. Both travel within cities, but I think to an even greater extent, travel between different cities. You know, there's a lot of debate about infrastructure in the United States, and it's widely considered to be one of the issues where there's broad agreement between people who vote for Democrats and people who vote for Republicans or Republican Party politicians and Democratic Party politicians. So infrastructure has been one of the main priorities of the Biden administration. They passed what's popularly referred to as the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the United States. And so the administration is touting this as sort of like this is a huge historic breakthrough that's finally going to fix infrastructure in the United States. But I think there's really reason to be skeptical about that. So the bill on its face, you know, the headlines in the media was $1.2 trillion. The United States government is going to invest $1.2 trillion in different infrastructure projects, wide range of different things, roads, bridges, ports, water, which is a huge issue in the United States. But really, I think it's important to keep in mind that that $1.2 trillion figure is really a fake number. So the United States spends a certain amount of money on infrastructure every year. And they added that total to the new spending, the new measures that the Biden administration is implementing. So the majority of that $1.2 trillion was going to be spent already. $650 billion was already going to be budgeted. So really, there's $550 billion of new infrastructure investment. But that figure is for 10 years. That's $550 billion spent over 10 years. So rather than thinking, oh, the United States is about to spend $1.2 trillion on infrastructure, the real number is like $55 billion a year. I think that the US government, frankly, isn't taking this problem seriously, even though they know it's a serious problem. And they just don't want to make the type of public investment because, in large part, because they don't want to generate those resources by taxing wealthy people or corporations. So it's a major, major issue in US society. So how has it changed in China in recent years? I think that's another thing that is really in people's consciousness in the U.S. that public transportation is being built out, you know, rapidly constructed. So I'm curious, have you seen any significant changes in how public transportation works in the country?
That's a quite interesting question. I believe the public transit in China can least on the top tier in the world. Because China has a very huge population, so we consider cities with less than 3 million population to be small cities. So almost every city pays very good attention to public transit. For the past 40 years, everything is going pretty well, and everything is changing rapidly. For example, my mom graduated from the college in 1988. She is from Harbin, which is like the one of the city in the north of China, and she got a job in Hainan province, which is like at the very down south. She took almost like 1 to 2 weeks from north to south. But today, if you want to go from Harbin to Hainan, maybe it's a 2 days trip. It's a 2 days trip. and you can buy ticket online. You can get all your trains connected. So that's how things changed in China for the last 40 years. I live in Shanghai, one of the biggest cities in China. Shanghai buses, daily passenger volume is around 4 million. The Shanghai Metro's daily passenger volume was more than like 10 million. More than 500,000 people take trains to the rest of the country from Shanghai every day. More than 300,000 people fly from Shanghai to everywhere every day. So it requires like careful planning and management. Every little problem can cause trouble for thousands of people. Almost all the public transit, doesn't matter if it is an airplane or a bus. They're all connected to the commanding center through different apps. So you don't miss a flight and you know when is the next bus coming. One thing is that public transit doesn't work for 24 hours in China. Most of them stop after midnight. So they have plenty of time to do the repair and maintaining and the upgrading. Most public transportation is operated by state-owned enterprises, but there is also private sector involvement. So here's the deal. The technology for the management of public transportation and public transportation requires innovation. So we can have private sector to compete in this part, the innovation part. However, the private companies seek profits. And if they are allowed to manage public transportation directly, it will raise people's daily expenses. The government and state-owned companies don't have that kind of problem. They don't have to worry about it. And in addition, public transportation needs careful management because it is the blood vessels of the city. So like everybody has only one brain, right? So it's transportation management. It is difficult for the private sector to do the same because the core value of market economy is competition. So that's pretty much how the public transit in China work. So how about the things in the US? How does public transit work in the US?
Right. Well, it's primarily managed at the municipal level, and it varies widely across cities. Some cities that have, substantial resources might have an okay public transportation system, but others might be very underfunded. Some might be relatively affordable, but in other cities, the costs might be very high. So that's one feature of it, that it's a decentralized system. There is a federal Department of Transportation in the U.S., but it's not centralized in the same way that you're describing in China. Public transportation can be quite expensive. For instance, I live in Philadelphia. It costs $2.25 to take the train one way, where, a small amount for one trip, right? But if you're commuting to and from work every single day, you're a working class person without a high wage job, it can add up. Another issue is unevenness in terms of the quality of public transportation. Like, it's not uncommon for you to be waiting for a bus and it just doesn't really come, or maybe it comes very late. So there's a lot of problems, a lot of unevenness there. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot more support from the federal government for these local public transportation systems. But that money is actually starting to run out now. So most cities have not had fare increases. The cost of public transportation has remained relatively stable. But that may change in the coming years as this federal support, the national government withdraws some of its support for these local systems. So people, I would say, in general, really do not like transportation. Travel between cities is even worse. So I take Amtrak to get to work, which is the between cities rail system in the U.S. The maximum speed for an Amtrak train is about 80 miles an hour. I think that's 130 kilometers per hour. So it takes a long time to get places, and it's very expensive. Amtrak is sort of a semi-private, it's essentially a private company that has a formal official relationship with the government. And so they have this variable pricing system that's very unpredictable. It could be relatively affordable, but for instance, if you're trying to get between New York and Washington, D.C., and you're buying a ticket, a day or two ahead of time, that could cost more than $100. So it's really expensive. It's really inconsistent, I would say.
Actually, since you mentioned about Biden's bill, do you have any major project mentioned in this bill, in this plan?
Sure. Well, I think that it's much less prominent. Much less prominent. There are, for instance, expensive projects to build a new tunnel into New York City. There's projects to build new roads, highways, bridges. But in terms of a single big ticket mega project that would really catch people's attention, not so much. Not so much. It's really more focused on repairs. Because there's such an urgent need for that in the United States. It's very dangerous, the state of infrastructure in the U.S. For instance, bridges. About a third of bridges, by some estimates in the United States, are in need of repair. They were built so long ago. And every once in a while, there's a tragic bridge collapse and people are injured. Sometimes large numbers of people die. So it's really sort of addressing a crisis of infrastructure in the United States is primarily what it's focused on. It's not so much focused on economic development. Let me give you one other example. One aspect of the infrastructure plan that's getting a lot of attention in the United States is around water. The pipes that the U.S. water infrastructure system relies on, very old. A lot of them have lead in them. So the water supply in many cities is actually poisonous. And racism in the United States has a lot to do with that. So take, for instance, the city of Jackson, Mississippi. This is the capital of the state of Mississippi in the U.S., and it's a majority black city. And the water is so dangerous that for a period of time, residents were actually not able to drink the water that came out of their faucets. There was a boil water notice, meaning that people had to actually boil the water before they could use it to get rid of the impurities, the poison essentially that was in it. And that's because the water infrastructure was so neglected, so deprived of investment, because Jackson is a majority black city in a state that has a state level government, which is responsible for the water infrastructure, that's notoriously racist. So all of these different political dynamics, all of these different inequalities in U.S. society are reflected in infrastructure as well. Another big piece of the conversation in the U.S. Infrastructure debate is environmental sustainability. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about that. How does the environment factor into planning for infrastructure in China?
We also take environmental issues into account, such as climate change. That is why we're making a big effort for clean energy, including hydroelectric power, wind power, solar power, and so on. And we have really achieved remarkable results. It is a culture thing for the Chinese government, doesn't break a promise. When they say decarbonization, they mean it and will achieve what they promise step by step. In 2020, China's carbon emissions were reduced by 48.4% compared to the number in 2005, exceeding the target of reducing carbon emission intensity by 40% to 45% by 2020 as promised to the international community. I want to mention another thing is that, let me put it in this way, since the current relation between China and the United States is not very good. So the American media selectively reports on the bad things about China, so do the Chinese media. For those Chinese who have been following American news, well, they are very aware of the current infrastructure crisis in the US. Like roads are broken, trains are shaking on the rails, and bridges are falling apart, and apartments are collapsing, like the apartment collapsed in Florida. So especially in New York City, it used to be like a dream for every city designer and developer in China. Well, in China, we even had a television program called 北京人在纽约, Beijinger in New York. It is about a Chinese musician giving up his middle-class life in the Chinese capital city and immigrated to the US to chase American dream. Even viral, it was a blockbuster in China. Sadly, like 30 years later, China has changed a lot, and New York is still that New York in the show. The airports, the subway, still the same, even older and full of like rats and trash. So nowadays, when Chinese talk about American cities, we focus on special things which can represent some idea, such as the Fifth Avenue representing fancy shopping experience, the Wall Street representing American financial supremacy. We simply just skip the infrastructure level because there is like almost no good news about it. Also because Chinese have already reached the top level in this area. We are not jealous anymore. Like our understanding of infrastructure has reached another level. For example, we care more about internet coverage. We don't want to get disconnected when we step into an elevator. We want to keep in touch on the subway. We are working on increasing the 5G coverage so we can upload information of the whole city onto the cloud. And city planners and city managers can make sure that we are not just having the best infrastructure, but also using them in the most effective way. In fact, every time we watch the news, American politicians say they want to invest in infrastructure. I assume that this matter is supposed to be politically correct in the United States. However, we only see people talking about it. We don't see any action. It is like saying, I love you to your wife every day, but not doing anything beyond that, right? So the truth is, there will be no infrastructure if you just talk about it. I actually wonder why it is so difficult to push for infrastructure in the United States. Some people say the legislative process in the US is way too complicated, and the fight between Democrats and Republicans are too intensive. But when the United States decide to bomb a country or ban China from buying American chips, they made decisions very quickly. They made those decisions which can damage the economic interest of the United States so easily and so quickly. But they have difficulty to make decisions which is good to the country. Like building infrastructure which can bring tons of jobs to the United States and raise people's income. You guys always say that how much you hate Trump, but think about it. If a Democratic administration can actually start a massive infrastructure investment, then it will get the support in the Rust Belt and the red states. Getting a job is what they care the most. So I don't think it's just a matter of legislation being too slow. So can you sum up some reasons for this?
Sure. I mean, it's a very interesting question. It's an infuriating question for many people in the U.S. But sure, I mean, it's broadly popular among people, of many different political backgrounds, ideologies. You would think that if there's anything that the U.S. government would be able to implement, it would be an infrastructure construction program. I mean, it's even good for big businesses too. But there's a major blockage and major inefficiencies on multiple different levels. So if we take the most recent legislative debate over the infrastructure law that the Biden administration was pushing for an example. So in the United States Congress, you need to have a bill pass the House of Representatives and the Senate. But in the Senate, it doesn't require just a majority vote. It actually requires 60 out of 100 votes. So the Biden administration would have actually been able to pass a much larger, more ambitious, broader infrastructure program. But they have this ridiculous, undemocratic rule stopping them. And there are also members of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden's party, that are opposed to public spending, public investment, almost across the board in general. So there's this sort of hyper-capitalist skepticism towards anything that involves the government making substantial investments. When that can be overcome, there's a lot of bureaucratic complications that come along with actually initiating an infrastructure project. Generally, there's multiple different layers of government that have to agree to it. So, the money might come from the federal government, and then some of it could come from a state government, and then it would need to be facilitated by the local government. Oftentimes, these are presented as quote unquote public-private partnerships, which means that some of the money comes from the government, some of it comes from private corporations, and generally, private corporations can make a lot of money and profit off of these things. So that adds another layer of difficulty, right? Because you're dealing with all of these different competing government agencies and entities on top of competing private entities and agencies. So it ends up being just this huge mess where, as you pointed out, very frequently there's not actually the completion of these projects, or it takes forever to happen.
Wow, yeah. As you mentioned, the different layers of the government and the conflict between the federal government and the local governments, it reminds me, it is very interesting. So the Department of Defense is, I guess, one of the most centralized institution in American government. And actually, it is the most effective department in the in the U.S. government.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And, to your point, you notice, right, that, when it comes time to go to war, spend money on the military, sanction other countries, there's never this type of debate. And, there's a saying in U.S. politics stops at the water's edge. Meaning that when it comes to issues inside of the United States, okay, we can debate, we can disagree. But when it comes to the rest of the world, essentially aggression towards the rest of the world, trying to dominate the rest of the world, once you leave the shores of the United States, the water's edge, then politics stops. Then all of these elite politicians get together and agree and get along very nicely. It's sort of this essential tradition in U.S. politics. Really, really a remarkable thing to observe.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because it's totally the opposite. When it comes to the international affairs, there will be a lot of debate in China. And people will some people are a little bit more hawkish. Some people are more like peace lovers. They will debate about should China to rival the United States? Should China to obey the so-called international rule? But when it goes to all the issues inside of the country, everybody agrees on economic development. We should invest more money on infrastructure or education or healthcare, whatever.
I wanted to ask you a question because in the US, one of the key features I think of the political system, and this definitely applies to infrastructure, is impunity, is a lack of accountability when you make a mistake, even a very severe mistake that could cause people to get injured or killed. So whenever there's one of these big infrastructure failures, like a bridge collapse in the United States, it's very rare for people to be held accountable who are in senior positions. Maybe somebody who's relatively low ranking could get blamed, but the people who are in charge of the system, and certainly the political leaders, are essentially never held to account for infrastructure failings, or really failings of any type. How does that work in China? I mean, is there that same level of accountability or lack of accountability?
Yeah, well, that's one big difference between the United States and China, I believe. Usually when we have an accident, no matter if it is a road or bridge collapses, the government will definitely set up an investigation team to investigate the cause of the accident and to figure out who is responsible for this. For example, after the collapse of a residential building in Hunan province last year, the local mayor lost his job for it. When an accident occurs, it is supposed to have someone to be held accountable. So I quite wonder how about in the thing in the United States, because we also saw an apartment building falling apart in Florida, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there's if there are investigations, but they're generally very long, very drawn out, and they're designed essentially so that powerful people can avoid accountability, can avoid blame. So there are different regulatory bodies, different safety agencies that will investigate when there's an accident related to, say, transportation, or it could be a criminal proceeding if it's truly egregious. But if you're a wealthy person, if you're a corporation with a lot of resources, you can hire a team of lawyers. You probably have political connections. It's very easy, especially as public attention fades, as these investigations drag out over and over and over. So many months or perhaps even years. It's easy for powerful people to avoid accountability in that way. I think that another feature that's important when it comes to who holds people accountable in the United States when there's these types of serious failures is really the lack of like a political alternative or a way for people to sort of express their displeasure, because it's bipartisan, right? It's both Republican Party politicians and Democratic Party politicians that preside over this collapse of basic infrastructure. I think that's really something that bothers a lot of people in the United States. Albert, I'm interested too in the perception specifically of young people in China about infrastructure. How do young people view the state of infrastructure in the country? Because in the U.S., it's sort of one of the things that youth look to as an example of, wow, things are really getting worse in the U.S. As time goes on, things are getting worse, not better. Our lives are more likely to be worse than our parents, right? Whereas in the past, parents were pretty sure that their kids' lives were going to be better than theirs, right? So the fact that infrastructure is in this sort of decrepit, crumbling state in the U.S., that really hammers home that point to young people in the U.S. But what's public opinion? What are attitudes like among youth in China towards things like public transportation, the state of roads, highways, that type of thing?
You mean the young people's opinion on China's infrastructure or on American infrastructure?
Yeah, on China's infrastructure.
On China's infrastructure. Okay. The thing is that for my generation, I was born in 1991. So when I was born, China was quite relatively underdeveloped. We didn't have very good infrastructure. So I can sense the fast development of infrastructure. I saw the very beginning of the high-speed train from like day one to now we have like one of the best high-speed rail system in the world. So I can feel it, I can sense it, and I can see it. But for the younger generation, they kind of like born to have it. So it is like for them, it is like a normal thing. For them, China is supposed to have the best infrastructure in the world. It is not a question for them if China should develop and should like getting better. What they want is like faster internet. What they want is like bigger, wider, and faster transportation, like more lines underground. So that's pretty much what the Chinese younger generation feel about the Chinese infrastructure. So you can see the difference between the elderly generation and the younger generation. For the elderly generation, as I mentioned, we even have a television program saying that a middle-class man in China were willing to give up his life in the Chinese capital city to move to the United States to chase his American dream. But today, when the younger generation go to like not just the United States, but maybe to Europe or to some other countries, they feel that maybe your roads are not good enough. Maybe your transportation are not convenient enough. Maybe you should do better. They don't think that China should do better. They think that other countries should do better. So you can see the difference.
Yeah, it's so interesting. In the United States, you mentioned internet, because that's actually a big issue in rural parts of the United States as well. There's this big push to build more high-speed broadband internet access in rural parts of the United States, where you would think basically everyone in the richest country on the planet would have no problem accessing the internet. But that's actually not the case. There's really big inequality between the cities and the rural areas when it comes to quality of infrastructure. And I'm wondering what that divide is like in China too. What are the big differences when it comes to infrastructure construction in the cities versus the countryside? Are there efforts made to overcome that?
China has not given up on rural areas either. The government has built roads in rural areas to ensure that farmers can have a better and easier access to go out and do business. Government have built network-based stations so that farmers can use their cell phones to sell agriculture products directly on the internet through live streaming, reducing the cost of doing business. However, those infrastructures are actually not economically efficient. So if you fully depend on market economy, the private sectors will never invest in these areas. So those developments are paid off by the government for the benefit of the rural population. So I think that is the concern in China.
Well, I think that might be all the time we have. It was very interesting having this conversation with you. I really appreciate this show, and I think these types of conversations are so necessary now when the new Cold War narrative is becoming so entrenched. It's really fascinating, and I really appreciate this type of exchange. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.